In this video series, I'm going to show you how to cluster SQL Server 2012 on Windows Server 2012. If you have watched my previous videos on SQL Server 2008 clustering, it is pretty much same. 2012 clustering is no big different than 2008, but there are few changes like multi-subnet, which is geo clustering. In fact, we have the geo clustering in the Windows Server 2008, but SQL Server 2008 couldn't leverage that. We don't have the that option into SQL Server 2008. So, but it has been added in SQL Server 2012. So now in 12 we can do the geo clustering. That is one major difference I can say. Like that, there are few other differences that you may want to know. So before going deep into the SQL Server clustering, we will look into it couple of scenarios. First of all, what is SQL Server clustering? Why do we need it? Before understanding SQL Server clustering, let us talk about standalone application first. Majority of the applications will be like this. You have database server and you have application server here, and you have the storage. In this case we have SAN storage. You might be having NAS or locally attached or iSCSI, whatever the storage to keep the database files. Okay, so you have the database server, and this is standalone server, and you have the application server, and you have the storage where you store the database files like MDF or NDF or LDF files. Okay, and here are your clients. Application server connects to the database server to get the data, and database server which has the connectivity to the SAN storage, and it processes the request and sends the response back to the application server. It sends the result set or whatever it is to the application server, and application server processes the result set and displays the result on the client computer. Okay, this is how majority of the applications will be. So this setup is typically called as standalone setup. You have just one server. Okay, so now the thing is, if this server goes down, then your application server cannot process the transactions. Okay, this is a single point of failure. You don't have redundancy for this database server. That is where the clustering comes into picture. In the standalone setup, in the client connectivity, the database connection string will have data source equal to, let us say, the database server name, you call it as a N1, and you give that N1 in the data source name, and optionally you might specify port. Typically 1433 is the default port, but if you are using different port, you might specify something like this. Okay, 6325. Okay, so this is how generally the application connection string will be. You will specify the data source name as a server name. Okay, I'm assuming you have installed default instance on the database server, and default instance will be the server name, and you give that server name in the data source name. Okay, but if you have instance name, then you might have to specify N1 slash whatever the instance name. Okay, but that discussion is different. Now this is single point of failure. If this database server goes down, for example, it could be hardware failure. Okay, or that there could be something. For example, let us say if somebody shut this server down, so then you have to bring this server up. So it will take some time. For example, if some hardware failure, then it will take much more time. You don't know how long it's going to take to fix a hardware. That is why you needed another server as a standby. typically this setup is called standalone setup. Okay. Now in the cluster, if you talk about cluster, you will have additional database server. Okay, there could be multiple database server. For example, I'm just talking about simple 2-node cluster setup. Okay, you have database server and you have one more database server as a standby, and you create something, a layer called around these two servers, a cluster. Okay, you create a cluster of these two nodes, and you give the cluster name as VSQL, for example. Okay, now in the connection string you don't specify n1. Instead you will specify VSQL. Okay, so if your application server is connecting to a cluster server, then you will specify the SQL cluster name in the data source name. You don't specify this any particular server name. So when you specify cluster name in the application server, then application server will first talk to this cluster name, and this will route this connection to a particular node. For example, at any point of time in the cluster, only one node will be processing the request. Another node will be just sitting idle, doing nothing. Okay, for example, if this server is processing the database requests, then it will be active. All the SQL Server services will be up and running on this machine. The SQL Server service on this machine, it will be down on this server. Let us say you call this server name as N2. Okay, so you call this as an active server and you call this as a passive server. So your N1 is active and N2 is passive. So N1 will be processing the database request actively, and N2, all the SQL Server services will be down. Both are connected to the SAN storage. Okay, both server has access to the SAN storage. So SAN storage, the disk that you create, the LUN you carve out, will be anytime attached to a particular node. For example, if this node is active, then SAN storage will be attached to this node. If this node fails, for some reason you just bring this server down, then this server will start processing the request. Okay, the services on this server will be up and running and start processing the database request, and SAN storage will connect to this server. Whichever server that is active, SAN storage will be connected to that server. Okay, so let us say N1 is active and N2 is passive. Okay, everything is up and running and everything is fine. All of a sudden this server goes down. And the SQL cluster, it fail over the services, whatever the SQL services that is running on this node, it will be failed over to this node. So the moment this server goes down, this server will start processing the database request. Okay, then application server, there will be a brief period of failover. So during that time, application server cannot connect to the cluster. Once the services start up and running on the passive node, let us say N2 in this case, the moment it start up and running on this server, then it can accept the database connection from the application server. Now it can connect to the, so application server, you don't specify database server name. Here you specify SQL Server cluster name. So the cluster will appropriately route the request, whichever node is active, it will route the request to that node. For example, if services fail over from N1 to N2, then when you connect to VSQL will route that request to N2. So this server N2 will process the database request and send the result back to the application server. That is how the clustering will work. So you have the failover, the redundancy. You have the multiple servers. If one server goes down, you have another server. That is the main cluster concept here. But there is only one single storage. This is single point of failure. if the disk goes down, so what do? That is why you need to have some other setup. For example, in SQL Server 2012, you can have always on. Okay, you can create availability groups. For example, in the remote location, you can have one more server, database server, with some disk storage. Okay, so you will set up always on to this server. So if something happens to the disk, to the storage, then you fail over the services from this setup, from this environment to this environment. So now your application will start connecting to this server. Okay, that is different story. How you set up the disaster recovery or high availability, using always on, or you can use log shipping. For that matter, you can ship the logs and you can set up another server as disaster recovery. For example, if your SAN storage goes down, or your hardware, everything goes down here. For example, you have major power outage in your data center, so you need to have disaster recovery server somewhere located. We should start processing the request from the application server. Okay, so you can set up using log shipping or always on, database mirroring or replication. There are couple of ways to set up the disaster recovery. Okay, but in this video I'm going to talk about clustering. Clustering is a high availability, so database should be highly available to the application. How it is going to highly available? By creating a multiple servers. Okay, so if this server goes down, you have this server. Like that, you can create some bunch of servers. You can create a 3-node cluster or 4-node cluster. You can go up to 8-node cluster. I think you can have 8 servers here. You can have 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. You can create cluster of 8 servers. Okay, and you can do plenty of things with cluster. In this video I'm going to talk about just a 2-node cluster. Okay, once you know how to cluster 2 nodes, it's just a matter of 10 to 15 minutes to add another node and do a cluster. Okay, as long as you have the server ready. That is the reason why you need to have a high availability concept like clustering. In any big shops, you cannot just run the show just with one server here or one server here, like that. This is small applications, or very small shops might do that, but you need to have some clustering mechanism for the high availability solution. So what I'm going to talk about in this video, pretty much whatever I have discussed in my earlier videos, SQL Server 2008, I'm going to do pretty much same. First, I will build a Windows Server cluster. We have to build the Windows. We have to cluster the Windows servers first. We have to create Windows cluster, and then we have to install SQL Server on the Windows cluster to create SQL cluster. Okay, that is the next step I will do. The third step, I will apply service pack on the RTM version. For applying service pack, first I will apply the service pack on passive node and do a failover, and apply the service pack on the new passive node. Okay, and after that I will set up the active cluster. Okay, active cluster means okay, I will talk about it when I come to that point. Later I will discuss about clustering analysis services and then clustering integration services. Analysis services and SQL engine, these two services are cluster aware. You can cluster these, but you cannot cluster SSRS or SSIS. Okay, but still sometimes you need to cluster integration services. There are ways to cluster it, so I'll show you how to cluster SSIS, and after that I will uninstall or remove a node. I will say remove the node, and after that destroy the cluster or remove the cluster or delete the cluster. Okay, Alright, so what are the software that we need? Obviously we need Windows operating system. In this case I'm going to use Windows Server 2012, and I need a VMware workstation. I need SQL Server 2012, and I'm going to do the clustering on my laptop. If you have watched my 2008 clustering, I have used Starwind software for iSCSI shared storage between two nodes. But in 2012, Windows has that software built-in tool. We can create iSCSI targets, so we can use that and make it available to the nodes, appropriate nodes. So we don't need Starwind software for SQL Server 2012 clustering. That is one difference I have found. And I have listed some of the URLs that you might be needed. So let me show you briefly what I am going to do in this video. This is my laptop. I have 8 GB RAM. Okay, and I have around 140 GB hard drive. Okay, so this is Windows 7 operating system, my laptop. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to create virtual operating system using VMware workstation. Okay, I will install Windows 2012 software on this machine, and I will make this machine as a domain controller. I will create domain controller because we need to create, we can create cluster on a domain controller. We cannot create cluster on work group machines or desktop machines. So I'll create a virtual operating system, Windows 2012. I'll make this as a domain controller, and I'll create three more virtual operating systems. Okay, so Windows 2012, okay, so first I'll create this server, make it as a domain controller. After that I'll create three more servers. I will install 2012 software on these three machines. I will join these three servers to this domain. Okay, and after that I will create cluster of these three machines, and after that I will install SQL 2012 software on these machines. Okay, so when I install SQL 2012 on this server on a clustered node, then it will be SQL clustered installation. Of course, you can install standalone software, SQL software on a cluster server, but typically you won't be doing that. So you can only install a SQL cluster on a clustered node. Okay, that is why we will create for Windows cluster. Okay, this is Windows cluster. Okay, so this is Windows cluster. I'll first create the Windows cluster of 3 nodes, and after that I'll install SQL clustering on 3 machines. Okay, while creating the servers, the virtual operating systems, I will allocate 1.5 GB RAM for every server. I have 8 GB RAM. I can allocate 2 GB for host server, which is for host computer, which is laptop in this case, and remaining 6 GB I can allocate for 4 machines. Okay, so in order to do that, I have prepared some nodes. In fact, I'm using the same nodes that I used for SQL 2008 clustering. For domain controller, I'm going to use this IP. I'm going to give this IP address to my domain controller, and I'm going to give this IP address for my node 1, and this is for node 2 and node 3. Okay, so node 3, which is a report server, let us say. Okay, so to create Windows cluster, we need IP address. Like that, we will be needing couple of other IP address for creating various clusters. Okay, so I just prepared this IP address. So we will be using this IP address when we are installing the SQL and Windows clustering.